Hello and welcome to the DC Dual Force podcast, and potentially the final day that this is actually the name of the podcast. But we'll get into that in the introduction. Hope everyone's having a fantastic day so far. Sit back, relax, grab, your favorite beverage, hang out, listen to it in the car, whatever you all do when you listen to the podcast. We've got, 30 to 45 minutes of some awesome DC Dual Force content coming your way. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about today was the name of the podcast. We've been rocking with the DC Dual Force podcast, which, is a perfectly fine name, but it's not very sexy. So we were looking for something with a little bit more oomph. We got a variety of suggestions. One that was brought up by community member Obi John was the Cape and Cowl podcast, Cowl podcast. And I think it's actually a pretty solid name. But this is also a democracy, not a dictatorship. So I wanted to kind of leave this up to you all and ask what you all think of the name. If you guys think it vibes, we can start getting some art and stuff put together for that. But let me know what you guys think down below, either on the YouTube comment section, find me on Discord or Twitter. I think you can add comments onto Spotify stuff as well. However you prefer to get your feedback across, I am willing to hear it. And speaking of Obi-John and just kind of the community in general, I am going to be starting to have some guest spots on the podcast soon. At least initially, my plan is to have a rotating slate of guest hosts to host the podcast along with me, just to kind of get a feel for how I interact with people. And if there's a particular co-host that, vibes really well, we put out a really awesome episode, you all love the way that the two of us work together, potentially, somebody may become a more permanent host in the future, but at least for the short term, I'm planning on rotating people, on a weekly basis. Those guest hosts should start, I'm planning on maybe the second week of September, so maybe 2 to 3 podcasts from now, 2 to 3 episodes from now. And I think the first 2 guests should be Obi John from Discord, as well as Black's Shazam, just working on scheduling and all those things. And I'm looking forward to all of that happening when and if they do. So that's it for the kind of introductory stuff today. I don't really want the intros to be too long as we get moving into this more and more. But the first thing I wanted to cover today was we got a patch. The patch released yesterday, August 22nd. The podcast should be coming out on the 23rd, so it should have been yesterday. And we got 2 main things in this patch. The first of which was a whole host of bug fixes. And from what I've seen, just in the initial, 24 hours, give or take, this seems to have squashed most of the major bugs facing the game. Now, obviously, that's not to say we are in a 100% bug-free state. We are probably a good ways away from that being a reality. However, the main bugs that I was seeing that were really becoming gameplay problems, whether that be people timing out their turns and locking me out of gameplay, or major card interaction bugs, mainly the Shazam disappearing, Mera's waves disappearing, and Flash being able to be hit by Lex's leader ability without being sacrificed. So a lot of the main bugs facing the game and interrupting the game or hindering gameplay were cleaned up in this patch. And on top of that, we got a handful of, I'm going to call them quality of life, but they really were necessary fixes in terms of when you AoE, it'll kill everything on the board at once instead of one at a time. Same thing with if you trade into something, the KO animations are now simultaneous instead of taking turns. And small things like that, while they may seem to be not the flashiest bug fixes, they really go a long way, in my opinion, of making the client as a whole feel more snappy and more smooth. I think that was one of the major complaints that I saw early on from players was the game was a lot of fun, but just things felt clunky or things felt odd. And besides the obvious bug fixes, I think the devs have done a great job pretty quickly of making things feel more smooth. Now, there may still be some server-side things to clean up over time, but at least as far as animations go, things have gotten a lot better. The final major improvement I think I'd like to see in terms of smoothness of the client is better ability to handle queuing of actions. That's still something that plays out a little awkward at times, and I think if they can improve the way actions get queued up, and if you're not familiar, what I mean by actions being queued up would be if I have 3 recruits on the board and I want to send all 3 of them at a particular leader's face, you know, you click and drag, click and drag, click and drag, and you're kind of setting all 3 of those actions before the previous action completes. Right now, those kind of can get stuck and play out a little awkward. So if we can get some improvements to the way actions queue up in gameplay, I think that would be, I don't want to call it the final piece of the puzzle, but another major piece of the puzzle to making the client as a whole feel really, really good. But overall, I know some people were hoping for some balance changes, and while I would not have been opposed to them, and I'm never opposed to balance changes, I don't think it was super realistic to expect those a week after we got what is, to be frank, a gargantuan balance patch. Like, I think the general approach should probably be either small changes weekly, or if they want to do patches the size of the previous one every, you know, 2, 3, 4 weeks, I think that's fine as well. Or maybe, you know, big patch every 3 weeks, and then every 2 weeks a small patch. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I think the overall point that I'm trying to drive home here is anytime there's a gigantic patch like we got last week, balance-wise, I think generally you should not be expecting further balance changes. And honestly, besides, you know, and I guess maybe we'll segue this into another topic, being, I guess, the current meta post last week's balance patch. Honestly, as a whole, I feel like things are very wide open. If you spend a lot of time in the Dual Force Discord, the current boogeymen in general kind of are inmates as a whole, which they've been. The newfound Green Lanterns that got buffed in the recent patch, if you're not familiar, the major buff was Chip becoming a free card. What was it, Jessica and I think Steven Baez or whatever. The 2 Bronze Lanterns became 1/4 and 4/1, and then they get +4 when they activate. So those got stronger, and John Stewart became a 5/4. But the major change, in my opinion, was Chip really getting that snowball started earlier. So if you ask Discord, you know, those 2 decks are kind of the boogeymen. And then you see a lot of people talking about just kind of tyranny control choking everything out. But that's not really how my experience has played out, and I obviously can see that it could be because of the decks I play. I kind of can affect how things play out, and I tend to play, you know, more mid-range, maybe skewing a bit more towards control decks in Dual Force, and even my control decks have a good amount of burn in them, so it can kind of close out games against other control decks. So maybe I just have more answers by default to a lot of the main decks. But also, I've been experimenting a good amount. I played a little bit of Lanterns with Wonder Woman, kind of more mid-rangey gameplay. That felt solid. I've been testing a, what is it? Batman and something else. I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't know why I can't remember. But I've been testing a Batman deck. Well, Batman Ivy. And that's felt decent. Still needs a bit more refinement on the top end. Certain decks I found, if I make it into the late game against them, I don't have enough pressure to close out. But this isn't really my own personal meta snapshot as much as it is me trying to say, I felt like things are more open than Discord would have you believe. Now, I don't have the data to back that up either, so I'm not saying that my opinion is fact here. But I felt like as long as you're packing just answers in general, unless you are the most proactive of decks, and those two decks that we just mentioned are probably the two most proactive decks, being Inmates and probably Lanterns trying to high roll. If you're playing those decks, you don't need to pack as many answers because you're planning on being the deck that is getting answered, so you don't really plan on needing answers. If you're not at that level of speed, at that level of pressure on the board, I think it's kind of just natural that you should be packing a decent amount of answers. And whether that's, your Ambush Bug and your Energy Blast and things like that in energy, or just making sure you have Batarangs and things like that in tactics, or what have you. And you want to make sure that as you're getting into your silver and gold plays, that you need to know what your deck is likely to do on those turns. And what I mean by that is, if you're not the most aggressive of decks on the spectrum, if you're not Inmates level aggression, if you're not Green Lanterns level aggression, you need to have a plan for what cards do I have, or what cards am I going to play that are going to clear the board and get me into the silver. My goal usually is, how do I get to double silver in a good spot? So that would be turn 4. So if you're not that aggressive, you need to know what cards do I need to pack in my deck to make it to double silver. If you're playing Tyranny, obviously that's going to be things like Culling is the obvious one. But for me personally, I think even in a non-inmate setting, I think Prometheus is an underrated card. Because even though he doesn't do a ton, if Prometheus soaks 1 to 2 attacks and they don't go at my leader's face, in general, that means Prometheus bought me around a turn to get to those double silver turns. So those are the things I'm talking about. I'm playing Shadow's Blade so that Prometheus can trade into things and survive and make it to next turn. I'm playing things like Earthquake and Arc Lightning and, take your pick. I'm playing a lot of damage-based removals in the factions that have access to those. But if I'm playing Tactics, I'm all in on, I still think Gordon's playable, and I'm still playing Robin. I'm playing Miss Martian because she trades up very well and can bounce back some high-value cards. My main strategy with most of the decks I build, especially because they tend to be on the slightly slower side, more mid-range to control side, I am packing my deck full of high-impact cards that can 2-for-1 as much as possible. You need to have some 1-for-1s because, if my opponent drops down Clark Kent, or my opponent drops down Black Mask, if my opponent even just drops down nothing but Chip, and if you have Ambush Bug for all 3 of those, I'm not saying missing out on that turn 1 removal loses you the game, but the difficulty level difference between being able to answer the turn 1 play and not is vastly different. And even then, I think it's important for players to use their leaders more strategically. Obviously, your opponent's going to be using their leaders back against you, so it's not like it's a, one-sided advantage, but, I play a ton of Shazam. And I know that 6 attack is, I consider it, when I can activate Shazam, a high-value piece of removal. So what I mean by that is, if I didn't draw well against Inmates, I'm probably doing the unthinkable and face-tanking Clayface just to get him out of the way. Or, something that's been buffed by Black Mask. If Black Mask is a 5/5 or a 6/6, I'm going to face-tank it. And a lot of people won't do that because you're taking a lot of damage on your leader. But sometimes that's your only way to move forward. And that's kind of a long-winded way of saying, I think the meta's in a really decent spot. And I'm not saying it's perfect. There are some changes that I would make, and maybe we'll cover those in a second. But I think it was just a long-winded way of saying I would not have made balance changes either quite yet. I probably would have waited a bit and see how things settle in this post-patch world, and I think that's what the development team is doing, and I completely agree with it. As far as, knee-jerk balance reactions just off the top of my head, I think some of the more snowbally cards should probably be once per turn activations, so Black Mask and John Constantine are the 2 main ones, in my opinion. I think those should be once per turn maxes. I think Lex should probably get reverted back to gaining 2 charges on activation. so that you can draw cards every other turn. Honestly, I'm not even fully convinced on that, but if the numbers behind the scenes, which again I don't have access to, if the numbers are saying that Tyranny and specifically Lex are being that oppressive, I think the answer would be not to nerf the cards, but to nerf the amount of draw that Lex has access to. Not 100% convinced on that one, but that's really the only change I would make to Tyranny at the moment. You could take the 1 health back away from Deimos. I don't think that honestly makes a huge difference one way or the other. I don't think that's the reason why Tyranny is playing well right now. Deimos' deployability is the main source of his power there. You could consider making Clayface +1/+1 on activation, but honestly, I think if you slow down Black Mask, Clayface gets a lot less scary. I'm sure there's maybe a couple other ones, but like I said, I really think balance is in a decent spot, at least for the short term, and we should just kind of keep letting things settle and see how things work out over time on that front, and then we can see how things go from there. All right, so we got through all of the balance-related stuff, patch-related stuff, but we got one more thing in this patch that we've not discussed yet, and that was another comic. And I'm going to, completely put my cards on the table and say, when it comes to Blue Beetle, I am a complete casual. I knew almost nothing about the character besides that there is a movie in theaters right now that I need to get around to go seeing, and I've not really done much research. So this Blue Beetle comic was, for me personally, and I imagine a lot of the players of Dual Force, was my first time really getting exposed to these characters in this universe, and also just kind of learning more. I think as somebody who, I wouldn't call myself a hardcore DC fan in terms of, reading the comics and knowing all of the kind of ancillary characters, but I enjoy DC stuff. I think these comics are a great way to kind of educate the masses on some of these lesser known characters and just kind of how they fit into the comic world. And this Blue Beetle comic, I think, does double time, because not only does it fit on that front, but it also serves as a way to introduce future content, being, I'm pretty sure we've already confirmed that the first subscription month for the game is going to be Blue Beetle focused. So putting out this Blue Beetle comic allows you to kind of introduce what this subscription's set of cards and character, and then if we get a Blue Beetle leader, what all of that stuff winds up being and meaning to the game. It's a great introductory tool for that, and it's kind of like that next level of value from the comics. And this comic in particular, I think, was really good. I've liked all the comics so far, so if you're looking for somebody to hate the comics, I might be the wrong one for that one. But in general, I think the fights were fairly interesting across the board. I think the very first fight, where you are kind of raiding the alien planet and you have all these awesome abilities that deal 10 damage to enemies, I think that was a great power fantasy moment in terms of introducing this level of inevitability and really making you feel like, as this character, you are more powerful than these, little defending guys that you're just going to kind of crush them under your power. So that encounter was a lot of fun. I think the storytelling in this comic was probably the best yet, in terms of telling the story of how Jamie became Blue Beetle, the whole Paco storyline, things like that. I think that was probably the best storytelling comic that we have received thus far. I saw some people kind of, I don't want to say upset, but saying that they would have liked to see another puzzle in this comic. We got puzzles in the first two. I think, in my opinion, the fight where Jamie was trying to take the scarab off his back and you had to destroy the modules, in my opinion, I think that one was meant to be more or less a puzzle. It wasn't directly in a puzzle in the sense of the puzzles we've seen thus far, but the encounter itself really seemed like it was designed to be a puzzle. Maybe not a very difficult puzzle, but I think a puzzle nonetheless. I think, in general, again, I know some things have been data mined. I'm not a big guy on data mine content. I don't like to cover it. I don't really even like to view it. just because as a software developer by day, I know how quickly, how often things change, and I don't want to be the guy that tells you guys, hey, card X is coming out on this date and it's going to have these stats, and then it changes and everybody's upset. I'd rather wait, and once things are confirmed, cover them then. So it is my assumption that a lot of the cards from this comic are cards that we will probably get during the Blue Beetle subscription month or the Blue Beetle mini set, whatever winds up coming. Things like Paco, things like the Jamie card, things like the Blue Beetle card. I think all of those cards are probably likely to be printed, if not as is, pretty close to as is. And what I will say on those cards is I think they were a very interesting new way of interaction. What I mean by that is Paco being a bronze that counts as a gold seems like it doesn't really matter, but then you have things like Blood Beetle, and you have the Jamie card, and you have Blue Beetle's leader ability, all caring about playing gold cards. So being able to do that on bronze turns or with a bronze resource is a really interesting new way of giving a powerful ability into the game, kind of like its own mini archetype, more or less. And then, I forget the girl's name, but the 1/1 bronze that draws all gold cards in the top 5 cards of your deck. That is a very powerful effect that also introduces new deck building levers to be pulled. And what I mean by that is having an ability like that means now, on average, what I see from most decks is they run probably anywhere from 0 to, on average, the average number is probably between 5 and 7 or 8 golds in a deck. If you're running that card, you have a bronze card now that you can run 2 of that can kind of filter through your top 5 cards, draw any gold cards. So it can be up to a draw 5, which is already incredible if you hit it. But honestly, even if you hit 1 or 2 cards, I would say 2 is the break-even point where it goes from like decent to really good. But even if you're drawing 1 card off of it, it is a gold card that you're taking out of your deck, kind of raising the likelihood that the next couple cards you actually draw as well are cards that will be playable. So if you think about the times, I'm sure we've all had them, where turns 1, 2, 3, even if you're only running 5 gold cards, sometimes you just draw 4 gold cards in a row and you feel like, I can't do anything, I'm just going to lose this game. If you were able to have played that bronze card, you would have been able to draw the 4 golds off the top of your deck, and then from there start drawing your quote-unquote actual cards to be played. So I think that card is going to make a gigantic impact if it gets printed as is, and it's going to be a very interesting card. The Jamie card in general, I think is going to be ridiculously powerful if it's printed as is. Although it really relies on having Paco, so it becomes a silver and a bronze combo to get a really strong payout. But I still think an Evade Hunter 7/7 is very, very strong. But honestly, the thing I liked the most was the Blue Beetle leader. The idea of a leader that starts out decent and scales as the game goes on, depending on how you play, is something that really, really appeals to me. Not just in the context of Blue Beetle specifically, but also in the larger scale context of the design space that now opens for leaders. Because up until this point, we've kind of had the mindset of black and whiteness, more or less, when it comes to leaders. And what I mean by that is a leader's ability is either good in the early game or bad in the early game, or it's good in the late game or it's bad in the late game. And there's not a lot of in between, or sometimes they're just okay all the time. Things like Cyborg are good as the game goes on, things like Black Adam are good as the game goes on, whereas, you know, New Wonder Woman might fall off a little bit in the late game. Now, you have this new kind of paradigm with Blue Beetle where, and again, this is assuming he gets printed as is, but maybe he doesn't, but the initial leader ability is a 2 charge, deal 3 damage to any recruit, which checks 2 boxes for me. It's a 2 charge ability that does not push face damage, so I am more open to 2 charge abilities that do things like that being more powerful, but also it rewards you for building your deck with a good amount of gold cards and playing gold cards, because as you play a gold card, you add 1 damage to the damage of your leader ability, thus making your leader scale throughout the game as long as you play gold cards and, you know, build towards your leader. And it feels like a really, really cool thing that you can mess around with a good amount for other leaders. Not necessarily our existing ones, but new ones that we get, being able to introduce this idea of, if you do this, then you get this payoff for your leader, and your leader can kind of scale up over time, and it allows them to kind of add more potential power because you have to work for it, versus something just being super strong and you either get to it or you don't, and things like that. So I'm really excited. I hope that Blue Beetle leader exists as it was in the game. But even if it doesn't, I'm excited just for the design space that the team getting in that area. I'm excited for what that opens up for the future. Really looking forward to that. Another thing that stood out to me was, again, like I mentioned, I am a Blue Beetle casual. There was a lot of cool characters in this comic. Not just the heroes, but that Phobia villain was pretty cool. Silverback was decent. What was the other guy? Brutal looked pretty cool. And just kind of seeing those characters had me very excited for the potential that we get, you know, leaders or cards like them in the future. And it actually has me wanting to dig deeper into that universe just because of how cool some of the characters seemed in the comics. And honestly, even some of those PvE cards, and you could tell they're PvE cards by the red gem. I think it means they're non-collectible cards. A lot of the cards that were those red gem cards felt like cards to me that could have been released maybe with slight tweaks into the game, and maybe we do get that at some point. But yeah, as a whole, really, really enjoyed the comic. Don't really have much constructive criticism on this comic, really. I think the team just kind of keeps stepping their game up with each comic in terms of what I'm looking for. And outside of comic hard modes, which is not, again, I'm not expecting that for a long time. Outside of that, I don't have a lot of pointers or, you know, feedback points on this comic. I think each comic is an improvement on the last, and it shows that the team is kind of hitting their stride with making these comics. And I don't really have much else to say other than I'm really excited to see how they keep progressing and keep developing moving forward. And the times when we get comics are really like high points for me. Even as somebody who mainly is playing PvP matches, that kind of PvE content is really, really fun, and I enjoy it quite a bit. Final topic we have for today is just, I'd be remiss if I did not mention it. When the patch came out, we had some unannounced changes come into the game. Unannounced meaning not in the patch notes. We had a developer come into Discord and explain them. Kind of some changes around the economy. I think this is the kind of end state that the team is trying to get to. So I guess quick refresher if you're not aware, the way we had been for the last couple weeks was your first 4 wins of the day got you 500 dual coins each, which would be a total of 2,000 dual coins, enough to buy 1 pack. And then after that, you got 100 dual coins per victory, up to a max of, I think, 7,000, something like that. I'm probably getting the max wrong off the top of my head, but you know, some high number. Once the patch launched, I think some players started noticing that they were having increments of 50 in their dual coin purse, let's call it. And as of right now, we're up into that point in the game, there was no way to obtain increments of 50. So people started asking questions, and we had a developer confirm that they had changed the economy to award 200 coins on a win and 50 coins on a loss. With the caveat being, in order to receive coins, period, the games had to last a certain number of turns, I believe. I'm not exactly sure on the details, but I believe you had to make it probably to like the first gold turn or something along those lines. And if you did not make it to that turn, nobody got anything for the game. Meaning, if I was playing against you and you conceded, I would not get 200 coins and you would not get your 50 coins. Now, before we address that whole situation as a whole, I want to put myself in the developer's shoes and talk about why I think those changes were made. As somebody who spends a lot of time in Discord, one of the most common complaints I see from newer players or players who might just not be that good at the game, those two groups of people, which, let's face it, is a large group of people, and you also want your game to be approachable for new players. One of the most common criticisms we received in the community was that it felt too difficult getting those 4 wins every day until you had more cards. So as you just kind of had your starter decks and as you were building your collection, players felt like it was too difficult to get wins just because of, card quality. Plus also, I'm sure, as you learn the game, if you're brand new, you're not going to be that great at the start. So it's going to be harder to win while you're kind of taking your lumps and learning how to play. So one of the major complaints being getting those 4 wins for 2,000 coins, too hard. Feels like crap never getting anything for losing. Now, I think the devs heard that feedback loud and clear. Now, again, when everything I'm saying right now, purely speculation. I have no information from the development team. This is me guessing and me trying to use my past experience working on a game and my current experience working in software and try and just kind of guess what I would think if I was in the developer's shoes. So hearing that feedback, I think they rightfully so wanted to address that main point of feedback moving forward, being players should receive something on a loss. Now, one thing that happens very commonly in software is unpredictable behavior or unintended behavior by users once they have access to your system. So what happened next? Once players realized that nobody got any rewards if the game did not make it to a certain turn, the immediate reaction, which is unfortunate, but it's just the way the internet works, people started abusing the system. And what I mean by that was, if I hate going against inmates, I queue against, Harley Ivy, concede, neither one of us gets anything. You play Clark Kent turn 1, I don't have removal, concede, neither one of us gets anything. You play Clark Kent turn 1, I do have removal, you concede, neither one of us gets anything. I play against somebody I don't like, I just concede because I don't want either one of us to get anything. So that started popping up a lot, and I mean a lot, just within the first, I would say, hour or two of the economy changes being discovered and then confirmed by the development team. And obviously that was kind of snowballing out of control immediately and needed to be addressed because A, the behavior is fairly toxic, but B, the goal being getting more coins in the hands of more players was backfiring because now no coins were going into any player's hands because of, I don't want to call it an exploit, but let's call it abuse of the system. So that got rolled back because the development team properly identified, hey, we didn't communicate this well, and this system already isn't playing out well. Let's fix that up. Let's roll back until it's ready for, prime time. After the rollback, I don't really know much of the details about, the technology behind the game, what they have at their disposal, their tooling. It looks like we have rolled back to the original Beta Bonanza economy, being 400 coins for your first win, then 300, then 200, and then 100 from there, or something along those lines. And I think right now as well, the reward track is not giving additional packs. So it seems like something either went wrong or got rolled back too far in the rollback process. And as of the time of recording this, the Discord as a whole is fairly ornery about rewards, and rightfully so, that playing a game where it takes, 10 wins or whatever to get a pack, and we're not getting daily free packs, and the subscription's not ready. I think it's fair to be a little bit upset at that point. But I think the more important point to discuss moving forward is how can we better communicate these changes and how to better prep the community at large for them. Obviously, you know, sometimes things make it into patches that we were not expecting to make it into patches. That happens to me at work fairly often. You know, you don't know somebody merged some code onto a branch, so things roll out that don't intend to roll out. You know, I'm not going to say all the time, but on a fairly often basis. I think one of the things that I would like to see from the development team moving forward in terms of communication improvements, one thing I did see get used yesterday was the in-game announcement system. I would like to see that system expanded eventually to kind of have like an inbox more or less, where if a announcement goes out from the development team while I'm not logged in, when I log in, I maybe have those messages queued up, unless it's something that expires, like if there were server issues or a patch was rolling out and the developers are saying like log out soon because we're going to patch, that can get removed from my mailbox. But, you know, a message saying new comic available, pop that into my mailbox, or, you know, new patch, go check out the notes. Things like that could be great for a little in-game mailbox if that is doable. Just because I would also like to see, you know, more forthright, or not forthright, but, you know, earlier information. Like if these economy changes were intended, you know, let everybody know before the patch, get it into the announcements in Discord. But, you know, even as much as I'd like to see some improvements on the Discord side of things, Discord is just a small slice of the cake. Most players are not in the Discord. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it might even be less than 10% of the most dedicated players wind up in Discord. So I don't even think it's necessarily a Discord communication problem to solve. I think it is an in-game messaging communication to solve. And I understand the team probably doesn't quite have the full slate of technology to fully address it quite yet. But I'm hoping that we see some additional things added in that area moving forward, just so that when these changes do come, they're communicated well in advance, and we can make sure that all players are seeing them. The ideal state is players don't need to find out about things in Discord, because like I said, most players are probably not in Discord, so being able to better inform them in-game and make sure that they don't miss those notifications in-game would go a long way, just for making players feel more informed and kind of more thought about, I think. So yeah, that's all we've got for today's episode. We have a lot of awesome stuff coming up. We have the September Brawl with Earlite coming on September 2nd and 3rd, I believe the dates are. So we are a little bit more than a week out from that. That is something awesome to look forward to. We have at least one more patch before then, so hopefully there's no crazy last-second changes to the meta before that tournament takes place. And we have, hopefully, I'm not going to spend a whole segment on this, but one of the devs in Discord said, obviously likely, that the subscription will start at the beginning of a month. They did not necessarily say next month, but if it's going to start at the beginning of a month, the next possible window would be the beginning of September, so we could potentially be 1 week away from getting the subscription. But again, that is not confirmed. We'll see how that goes moving forward, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing that soon. Fingers crossed for September, everybody. But yeah, that's going to be it for now. If you guys have any questions you'd like to have answered for the next episode, get in contact with me however possible. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. I did try and work on the audio a little bit. I know we had a little bit of issues on the last episode, so hopefully that was noticeable as well. Thank you all so much for watching or listening, and we'll see you guys next week. Have a great week.